Hey guys, Saf here with another Raid Shadow Legends video. Today I'm going to be looking at a question that we get asked so many times in the Discord community, but is actually really important to understand, and that is this champion better than this other champion for dealing damage? Or which champion out of these three would I best use for dealing damage? Now, I'm going to be looking at sort of the different systems that we have in Hellhades.com to analyze that, including our grading system. And I'm also going to do a bit of a breakdown on why I think some of the basic spreadsheets that we see out there that just look at multipliers are a bit misleading, and actually you need to take the steps that we have taken to almost review the champion's ability in more detail. At the end of the video then I'll give a bit of a top 10 breakdown of different damage dealers in terms of clan boss, in terms of single target, and in terms of AoE, so we can kind of see where the best damage dealers are right now. So let's first take a look at sort of where the information is coming from and what is currently out there but outside of Hellhades.com. There are a couple of spreadsheets out there that I don't maintain, that I've used in the past many moons ago. And you see this example here of Ash Voyager's RSL damage multipliers. Now what these are really good for is just quickly looking up some attack multipliers, defense multipliers, and he has done a bit of an analysis in terms of sort of trying to build their damage out by looking at a base stat. Now the key thing you need to understand whenever you're doing a damage assessment or looking at a champion going, can it do damage, is there's three main things. Their base stat for the damage that they deal. Typically, if it's HP based, it's going to be quite weak unless they have some unique double hitters. The next thing you want to look at then is the multiplier, which isn't in the game data. You have to use either Hellhades.com or other sources to find that. Hellhades.com is accurate, 100%. We get it from the game data. And then the third thing you want to look at then is things like book damage percentages and any sort of bonus multipliers that the skills have, because these will then adjust and increase damage to a new level that maybe other skills don't do. It is not good enough for you just to go, this champion's got the highest base attack with a really strong multiplier, therefore he deals a lot of damage. And I'll give you a good example of a champion that you look at his base attack, you think he must hit extremely hard, and his multiplier, but it just doesn't work out. So the highest base attack champion in the game is Bistophus, the blue man group man himself, and he has got nearly 1800 base attack. Now that is significantly higher than most champions. I think some of the top 10 we'll look at is probably around about 1500. He's got two AoE abilities, which is a great thing for an arena situation. If the first AoE doesn't hit, you've got the second backup. And he's got a nice amount of books. And that A2 is godlike, but you'll see when we look at the top 10, he doesn't really get close. And that's just because his multiplier isn't high enough. He's got a few issues with his base speed, and just the way that the damage calculates in terms of champions who have bonus multipliers, ignore defense mechanics, they tend to overpower his sort of raw base attack. So you need to look at all of these things together. Base stat, multiplier, books, multiplication effects on the champion, extra hit mechanics, and ignore defense mechanics are probably the most significant one for arena specifically, but in other areas as well. So how do we do this on Hellhades.com? Every champion that you look at here as an example will have the multiplier, which is game data. That's not something we make. And then you've got an overall grading. Now, we could give you a specific estimated damage profile number, but it is meaningless to understand for most people, because all they really want to know is it a really strong hit or not? We do have a spreadsheet that is on the Raid Shadow Legends tier list, which you can download, and I will be doing a refreshed version when this video goes out to update it to include all the 5.1 champions and anyone else, and just some adjustments that we've been tweaking as we've been perfecting our formula. But what this grading does is it takes the sort of ranking and it puts them into a sort of brackets, and then that can basically tell you, is this a top 10, 15% damage dealer? So how does this work? So there's a post on the website, and it is linked on every single champion page, and it kind of breaks down how we've approached this system, how we have particularly graded a champion. And this will be unique to Hellhades.com. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, because the game has over 600 champions with lots of unique and different mechanics. But it is the best way that I have seen it done so far to give you an accurate profile of a champion's ability to do damage. The first thing we do is we have three types of grading that we consider. So obviously an AoE damage ability is neutered in terms of its damage potential, because you don't want an AoE damage that can hit all people the same as if it was hitting one. Generally in Raid, that's how the game works. Single target abilities are much higher in terms of damage and multiplier than the AoE components. Also, A1 abilities, because they are not cooldownable, they're not considered to be sort of an expensive resource in terms of how you build your champions, they tend to have lower damage as well. So we have basically got an A1 damage grade, we've got an AoE damage grade, and then we've got a single target and random damage. This is then grouped into bandings, essentially. So we've got weak. What weak is essentially the bottom 15% of this list. So once all the champions have gone through the formula and they put into a 1 to 650 list, the bottom 15% in terms of their damage will be considered weak. Then your 15 to 50% are average, 50% to 85% are then considered strong, and then the top 15% of all damaging abilities in that particular category is considered godlike. When we have initially created this, obviously there's now loads of new champions, we always go back and we will review, renew, check the bandings, make sure the breakpoints are all correct. So it's constantly updating and live, and then we always update the website. So sometimes you might look at it 6 months and go, well, this champion used to be godlike, he's now gone down to strong, probably because he's been power crept by new champions. So how do we essentially create the formula that creates the damage baseline? So this is going to be quite complicated. I would highly suggest you read this yourself in your own time, but I will go through it and kind of break it down. So the first thing we do is we kind of build out a champion based on their base stats and kind of give them an average build. So this is based on a formula that determines how much stat gain you get from things like your primary stat on your chest, boots, on a typical build, your substat rolls, flat stat rolls from helm, whatnot, depending on the damage you get. So that generally is a universal model that gets applied. So it takes into consideration effectively if someone's got a higher base attack, then their final build should also be higher on an equivalency state. So what we do then is we create a realistic battle scenario. So the first step we do is we will build a champion based on their base stats. Effectively, we pass a formula that grows the base stat to what you would typically get on a good late game build. It's not insane stats. We're not talking like min-max to the degree. It's just a good math assessment that kind of estimates where you get to. I'll probably just at the end of the video kind of give you an example of what kind of stats we're talking about here so you can see that it's realistic. This then is then passed in, and we then assume that every ability crits 100%. Obviously, we don't make any sort of stat adjustments if someone's got a built-in 20% chance to crit. That's just assumed, but that is something you should probably take into account. Then the thing that most of the spreadsheets that you see around don't do is they don't really pass it into a battle scenario. So, for example, champions that generally ignore defense are always going to be much stronger damage dealers, but most of the estimators and calculators out there haven't gone that far, because either it's a partial ignore defense, which means then the target's defense is relevant, and vice versa. So what do we do? So the first thing we do here is we give them a stat buff. We assume that if you're going to be running an attack-based nuker, you're going to give them a 50% attack buff, a defense-based nuker, 60% defense buff. We then will pass sort of default numbers based on the types of modifiers that skills have. And by a modifier, I mean something that boosts the damage of the skill. Classic example is Turvold. The more buffs you have, the more damage it gets boosted. However, we need to determine how many buffs we're going to calculate this on. And this is what this full list here is, effectively. We've got everything from increasing based on the number of debuffs on an enemy, buffs on themselves, how much HP they've lost, how much HP they've lost on themselves, how many dead enemies, dead allies, if they buff based on their own speed. There are a few champions that still do that for some reason, and anything like flat multipliers. Those sorts of things are all factored in. So the general rule is if it's a buff or a debuff, we do it at 3. If it's a how much HP you have lost yourself, it's 50%. So if that means that the skill gains more damage as you lose health, like Leorius, we fix that at 50%. If it's based on being at 100% HP for the highest damage, then we assume you're going to keep the champion at 100%. Generally, what we're talking about here is use the champion in the way that the skill is designed to be used. That's what we are simulating. Finally, then, we do have a control for random attacks. Now, on a single target, like a clan boss, like a boss, then obviously random attacks is technically single target. So you can just do the standard one hit times number of attacks. But generally for wave content, it doesn't work like that. So we've assumed that a random enemy attack is a single target of one random enemy. So we're going to assume that if you attack 4 times randomly, one of those ability lands. So you will see in our spreadsheets and our estimations that random attacks are generally considered weak or average. But when you consider them into a single target component, which is an example I will show at the end, which I'm hoping to update to the website, you'll find that they suddenly could become from average or weak godlike in certain abilities, because we know all random abilities are going to hit the same target. Then the next thing we add is damage skill upgrades. They are very, very impactful. If a champion has 10% on his books and then another champion has 30%, they're always going to hit 20% harder, and that 20% represents a significant damage boost when you start factoring all these different elements, so that we include them and multiply the damage by that point. There are a few special rules. Every champion in this game is meant to be unique. Not all of them are, but some of them have really unique mechanics we need to account for. Thea the Tomb Angel, we assume 4 hexes are present. There are a lot more hex champions out there now, so it's pretty easy to get that number of hexes out for her damage. Samar's A2 is a bit of a weird one, so we've calculated it based on 2 buff difference and 25% HP. Gergo the Augur always does his A2 first, so we're going to assume that there's a freeze out. If a freeze is out, you have a 25% penalty to damage, so his damage and abilities are always going to be 25% weaker. And then passives such as Brogni and Geomancer, we don't really consider or calculate them alongside enemy max HP. We just assume by default they're going to be really strong because you're going to use them against bosses. Cold Heart A3, you won't see them on top damage dealing lists in our grading, but you will see them graded as godlike. So it's just very difficult to simulate an enemy max HP because they are all variable. And then finally, the big thing that our grading does that I don't see many spreadsheets and other tools do is we pass all of this through the damage reduction formula. Every target has defense. That defense goes into a formula. That formula is then what produces a percentage of how much a damage is reduced. Typically anything over about 4,000, it's near 80 odd percent, 85%. Anything around about 1,500, it starts going quite deep. It's just the way that the formula works. Essentially, you get a lot more damage reduction between 1 to 2,000 than you get to 2 to 4,000. So we've picked 3 tiers. The clan boss, Ultra Nightmares 1520, so that's 1 tier. We've got a general defense number, 2,500, which kind of covers you for most areas. And we've got an arena defense of 4,000. This assumes you're not applying decreased defense. However, if you've got an arena opponent which has 4,000 defense and you apply a decreased defense, then you're going to be looking at damage roughly on the same scale as a general damage. Once we have all this, we also include things like ignore defense. We include all the different things, all the different multipliers, and that produces us a baseline damage number. So a few things to cover that we have excluded. Masteries are not included. Great Hall are not included. Arena bonuses are not included. The reason why is this is a universal multiplication gain. And what I mean by that is if I have, for example, 20% of attack in my Great Hall, then every champion that I have will have that 20% attack. Therefore, it doesn't change which position they sit in the order. One is just going to be 20% stronger now because I've got that bonus. Artifact sets, again, we don't factor in. It's a universal thing on all champions. If I put Savage on one champion, that means the other champion is going to also gain 25% ignore defense. So yes, it might manipulate the outcome somewhat, but it will be universal. It won't change the ranking. And critical damage, we only multiply the crit hit based on the base critical damage. So that's a good way for us to analyze whether or not someone is losing out from having a lower base crit damage. But effectively, if I multiplied it at 200% crit damage or 60% crit damage, the order isn't going to change on the champions because you're doing a multiplication of the damage base. It would only matter, like in the example we're using here, is if the base crit damage was 13% less, because now that is 13% less damage. So that's how the grading works. Let's take a look at the top 10 lists now and see how this actually translates into a damage number, and to see, you'll probably see a few quick, clear reasons why our grading does different things to other spreadsheets. So just an example of how this is actually quite awkward on Ash's spreadsheet is if I wanted to answer the question, what's the hardest hitting AoE champion? You know, what's the hardest hitting AoE ability even? It's very difficult to actually just do it here because this list essentially says that Ray, Big and Robar and Trunder is the top 4. Now, I'm going to show you my AoE list and you'll see quite clearly that it doesn't correlate at all. But just as an example here, you know, you can't really sort it out. This is the reason why these spreadsheets are a little bit useful, but not exact, not accurate. So these are my top 10 mathematically highest damage dealing champions in the game. This doesn't mean you can make this work because some of these champions require unachievable or unrealistic outcomes. However, it's, you know, if we're talking about a math analysis, this is what this is. Realistically, I would probably refer to some more expert arena players for an AoE or even some clan boss like Deadwood and other content creators who play more often in certain specific areas and are more niche if you want to know sort of a top 10 best champions to use. But this video is all about which champions hit the hardest in the game, mathematically speaking. And you quickly see, compared to the last spreadsheet that we were looking at with Ash Voyagers, my list is very much different here. Baron is the #1 AoE damage dealer in the game. And the reason why that is because he's the one that ignores all defense. This is the concept of why you need to simulate the right environment against a specific target defense, because until you do that, you would never realize his damage is so high because his multipliers are probably not as high, taken into the fact that he's going to ignore defense. Now, the hard thing with Baron, obviously, is you've got to activate that hidden skill. But if you do, that is significantly, just looking at this number, the highest damage ability in the game. Then you've got Ruel. Again, Ruel is not used that often because he needs a lot of setup. But if you manage to get the 4 hexes out there and you don't suffer from Resurgent or other RNG mechanics, then his ability is significantly stronger at 46,000. Then we've got Thea. Again, need hex out. Robar got a buff recently, hits really hard at 32,000. And then we've got everyone's favorite DPS nuker, Trunder, on her A3. Then we got Kytis. Again, battle scenarios. Kytis, you need everyone dead. I believe that's his specific one. That's hard to achieve realistically, but if you do, he's in the top 10. Then we get Ray. Ray was Ash Voyager's #1. Ray is near #7 for me, and that's only her A2. Then we got Leorius the Proud. Remember, this is Leorius at 50%. So there is a lot more growth for him to become a lot higher. So if you run him in arena defense, then he quickly becomes the strongest AoE nuker in arena defense at 1% in Swift Parry. Finally, we've got 2. One of them's probably unknown. I think Hellhades did a video on it, but it's pretty cool. If you manage to get Freeze out, Houndspawn will ignore 100% defense. So this assumes Freeze is out, so obviously it's reducing it by 25% still, but it's still a really hard-hitting ability because it ignores defense. And then finally, we've got the new guy, Constantine the Dayborn, who has a defense modifier. Now, I've set his A2 as 20%, just because the difficulty of actually getting all 3 debuffs is actually very hard. I think there's only one setup, which I'm currently working on in the game, that could potentially unlock all 3 required mechanics to unlock his ignore defense mechanics on his A2. So you can see that he is just creeping in at the bottom 10 on his A2. So that is the mathematical current list of top 10 damage dealers who do an AoE ability. All of these are rated godlike. Obviously, there is a lot more abilities. If you want to see the full spreadsheet of this one, you can download it from the hellhades.com on the tier list page. So let's take a look now at single target. And I specifically want to compare single target here to clan boss, which is the third list we're going to look at. So again, single target, you're seeing a lot more prevalency of defense modifier based champions. If a champion ignores 100% defense, it immediately puts them at a lot higher position. So the #1 by a massive margin is the 5-hit ability on Jintoro's A3. This is just the 5-hitter, so it's not a combination of the A1. The A1 is still pretty hard hitting as well, but the 5-hitter is by far and large the single hardest hitting ability in this game. Just trying to get it to activate is hard outside of a clan boss scenario. The next hardest hitting ability, which is probably the most easily accessible one, is Inquisitor Shamael. Put 3 buffs on him, and you can do this by putting a blood shield with sort of a divine set and a couple of other, like a buffer, like an attack buffer, like Arbiter, and you've unlocked his A2. that will ignore 100% defense. It is by far the second hardest hitting ability in the game. It's probably the most accessible one as well, along with Royal Huntsman. He is number 3. Again, he ignores all defense. Then you've got Tua Messia, a relatively new champion. Now this is based on the multiplication of HP burns. So we've calculated it as if 5 HP burns are out. Her ability is a bit of a weird one in the sense that it works out based on the number of enemy and ally HP burn debuffs that are out. So you can really boost this even higher, potentially. And I've seen her work really well in Hydra as a good example. But yeah, this is based on 5 HP burns. So she is at number 4. Then you get Little Miss Annie. Her A3 is a bit messy in the sense that you've got to get the right HP levels, the right defense. But if you assume to use her in like an arena setting or maybe a high Doom Tower setting if you wanted to, the chances are their defense is going to be higher than her defense and their HP is going to be higher than her HP, which means she hits twice and she ignores 25% defense on both of them. That's what makes her a really strong ability. Use her in a clan boss, however, she doesn't even make enough damage to make the top 50, I'm pretty sure. Just because you don't get the extra hit because the base defense is always going to be lower than yours. And remember, it's got to be after you do the debuff. Next, we got Errol, pretty much a legacy champion. Again, this one's awkward because there's no guarantee that you're going to be getting the ignore defense. It's 50% chance he completely ignores. But if he does do on all 3, it's an absolute smack. And he's also got 45% damage in his books. That's insanely high. I think that's higher than any champion in the game. Then we've got Elder Skarg. It's a 6-hitter if it all lands. This is like Calvalax. Very strong ability. Whisper is the Amazon Prime legacy champion ages ago now. But that champion is probably better than Faceless for Night Revenant, I would argue, because she gets extra turn mechanics and she can provide her own ignore defense with Weaken. Stick her in a Relentless set, she probably does more than Faceless if you're struggling for champions. But that A2 will ignore 100% of defense if a Weaken is out. Then we got everyone's hated enemy, Mortu. I have spent far too many times in an arena trying to get his peril out. If you manage to activate his peril like Baron, 100% ignore defense, and it block revives. It's an awful ability to face PvE and a frustrating ability in PvP, but it is really powerful. And my personal favourite on this is Richthof the Ball. Not many people really consider him as a high damage dealer, but if you can get enough poisons out there and you get enough crit damage on him, you can really do some crazy damage with Richthof on his A3. Certainly, like, surprising to me even that he's in a top 10 list of single target abilities. But the thing I want to point out here is how much of a gap there is between your top sort of 5 and your bottom 5, just the top 10 alone. You know, the Inquisitor Shamael is doing 84,000 as a baseline damage, whereas Richthof is 48,000, and he's only 8 places lower. So there is a big gulf between certain niche, very, very strong champions. So we're going to look at Clan Boss now as a specific tier. Now with Clan Boss, obviously we can control some mechanics much better than we can other parts of the game. We can guarantee debuffs, we can guarantee certain buffs are going to be on our champions. So we've adjusted the mechanics and the criteria for this tier specific to that. And what you will actually see is some champions then change order. Others can defeat the ignore defense mechanic because generally the clan boss has low defense to start with. And yeah, so let's have a look and see what we got. So we got Jintora still the number 1 champion, of course, still strongest ability by quite a significant margin, even in these conditions. Then we get Calvalax. Now Calvalax's A3 is a target max HP, but the way that it works on Clan Boss, obviously the Clan Boss has a passive that will reduce any max HP ability to 75,000. So what that basically means is his passive component has a damage aspect based on his attack, and then he will add 75,000 onto his ability. So you only actually need 1 poison out to maximize his damage on his A3. That then becomes the second hardest hitting ability in Clan Boss. Then we have Turvold. I think this is calculated on 10 buffs, which is quite unrealistic, but you can easily see like the more buffs you have, the more this becomes extremely powerful. Next up we have a Doom Tower legendary champion, Val the Destroyer. Now obviously you need to do a lot of Doom Tower Secret Room hard levels to be able to get him, but his A3 ignores 30% defense, and this is assuming that you have fully stacked his attack up to maximum. If you do that, which is quite easy in Clan Boss, it's a massive hit, and he is probably next to Turvold. I think Deadwood has just done a video on this recently, so go check that out on Val the Destroyer. It's pretty fun. He does a spinny axe thing. It's awesome. Then we've got Elder Skarg. The 6-hitter is a massive hit because it just will, you know, it's a single target. All of them hits on the single one. You can really boost the damage. So Elder Skarg comes in at 5. Then you've got Ninja. Now this 8-2 doesn't include the HP burn, so it's stronger than this if you factored in the HP burns as well. However, we only factor in on-hit damage and effects that affect the on-hit damage rather than the actual debuff damager itself. That's why you don't see any poisoners in terms of how much poison damage goes on, because that's a separate mechanic. Then you've got Shamael and Royal Huntsman. Again, ignores defense, so they do pretty much the same damage universally. Errol as well. And then last but not least, we've got Richthof in there with his A3, again, assuming you've got 10 poisons out to actually deal that damage. So you can see how the actual effects and modifiers of your champion's abilities does affect whether or not you can consider them to be stronger or weaker than another champion. And you have to take that into account, especially ignore defense mechanics. Inquisitor Shamael effectively becomes the hardest hitting champion in most parts of the game because he can ignore 100% of the defense. I hope that was interesting for you, and it shows that actually understanding how all the different mechanics work against the opponent that you're facing and the conditions that you set them under really does make the difference between how much damage a champion could do and how much it will do. And simply doing a base stat multiplied by multiplier multiplied by number of books is not really enough, in my opinion, to give the champion a fair shout in terms of, is he a stronger damage dealer than his competition effectively. As always with our videos, we release these every week and we take a deep dive into the math behind Raid Shadow Legends. If you've enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you want to get more of these straight into your feed, please subscribe. It helps us to continue to develop these content, and I will catch you in next week's video.